Normally, we meet in front of the White House at this time, at the exact moment of the dropping of the Hiroshima bomb. And then we usually have a discussion and a testimony around in a circle.
So,
But we're not there this year.
yes. So why don't I take that as a signal? Uh, so I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to the Hiroshima Remembrance for the National Capital Area. We've been doing this every year since 1981, and so this is our 41st annual commemoration. The reason why we do it on August the 5th is that August 5th at 7:15 p.m. was the exact instant that the city of Hiroshima was destroyed by the Hiroshima bomb. And Albert Einstein, amongst many quotes, said, in that moment, at that instant of the destruction of Hiroshima, everything changed except for the way that we think. And thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. So that's a direct quote from Einstein. So we took that quote to heart, and we decided that it was important for us to remember the exact instant of the Hiroshima bombing. So in about another 8 minutes, well, we're going to be having a minute of silence before we begin the formal program. But I'd just like to do a brief introduction about our committee. So in Washington, D.C., for many years, starting in the late 1950s, there were Hiroshima and Nagasaki commemoration programs. A lot of them were centered around the Washington Peace Center, but they also involved groups like Sojourners and various others, a Fellowship of Reconciliation, various other groups. And it was an ad hoc event. So each year, one group or another group would take responsibility for it, but nothing was really organized. So in 1980 and 81, Louise Franklin Ramirez, Dr. Arjun Makajani, and Josephine Butler were the three principal individuals who decided there needed to be an organized remembrance of the atomic bombings. And so they came up with the Hiroshima Nagasaki Peace Committee of the National Capital Area. So we had our first event in 1981, and we put nuclear war and weapons on trial. We had over 500 people there. And since then, we have been organized as a group. And every year we organize commemoration activities. In 1983, we were informed by Women Strike for Peace that a delegation of A-bomb survivors was literally on their way from Washington, D.C. from Japan. And so our committee went to the Methodist Building, and back then, most of the national peace groups had offices in the Methodist Building, and so we organized a reception for the A-bomb survivors. And it was very interesting, the reaction. And I know this won't surprise Dennis Nelson at all, who is a downwinder and is a radiation survivor in his own right. But there was very little interest among the national peace groups in meeting with the A-bomb survivors. The response that we got overwhelmingly is, we're involved in very important things. We're involved in disarmament legislation, and we have 10,000 people in our group, and the bombing of Hiroshima took place, many, many, many years ago, and it's really not relevant anymore. And besides, nobody wants to hear about the atomic bombings, and certainly nobody wants to hear from A-bomb survivors. It's just too unpleasant. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I'm not exaggerating that much. And so I remember that Louise, our founding member, my late wife, and Edith Vellastrigo literally went to these offices and strong-armed the people in the offices to at least send one person down so we'd have a decent reception. So that was the beginning of our work with the atomic bomb survivors in '83. And over the years, we've hosted, I would say conservatively, perhaps as many as a couple hundred, but certainly more than 100 delegations, sometimes as many as 3 or 4 or 5 a year. We worked with the A-bomb survivors to oppose the exhibition of the Enola Gay at the Smithsonian Institute. In return, we have sent dozens and dozens and dozens of delegations, including about 13 youth delegates, young people in high school, college, and in their early 20s. We've sent them to Japan, and the A-bomb survivors have hosted us. So we've been very, very busy. We support radiation survivors. That's central to our work. All kinds of radiation survivors. We did a program with children of Chernobyl. We've worked with the Kazakhs. We've worked with the Marshall Islanders many times. Of course, with the A-bomb survivors, also with the atomic veterans, and with the Downwinders group. So we are, and we continue to organize every year. We also have organized numerous, I would say it's safe to say, dozens of protests against nuclear weapons. And the other thing that we've done, and then this is largely, I think, the work of Rick Tingling Clemens, maybe more than anyone else, but we've always made a conscious effort to link our work against the bomb with our work for environmental sanity, and our work for social justice, and our work against racism and against misogynism and all these other things, because we see all of the issues as related and connected, and they all, in our estimation, they all kind of come together in the form of nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons are we have 2 existential threats now. We have the threat of nuclear war, which is always with us, and now we have the threat of climate change and global warming and climate change. And we also recognize that as the climate becomes more and more destabilized, as resources are depleted, that it's more and more likely that we're going to have regional conflicts over forced migration, these kinds of issues. And at any time there's a conflict, say for example in the Ukraine as we speak, the risk of nuclear war goes up, and the threshold to nuclear war goes down. So I'd like to stop speaking now, and I'd like to call everybody together. And so what we're going to do when I give the signal is we're going to have about 2 minutes of silence. So I want everybody to mute now, if you will. And so it's 7:15, and we're going to have a moment's silence to remember the exact moment of the Hiroshima bombing. All right, so let's keep muted, if that's all right. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a program. Our keynote speaker, so to speak, is Mary Olson. I'm going to ask Diane DeRigo from Nuclear Information Resource Service to introduce her. So I'm going to introduce Diane. Diane's going to introduce Mary. Then Mary's going to speak about her life's work. It's in there. I'm sure that there's going to be some questions. So what we'll do is when Mary finishes, we're going to do a question and answer specifically for her. And then at that point, we're going to ask Diane to talk a little bit about her work with nuclear waste issues. And then we're going to call on Jim Wagner, Dr. Jim Wagner, who's an environmental expert and an environmental health expert. And then he's going to talk a little bit about hope for the future. And then at that point, we're going to open it up for a general discussion. And so the expectation is we'll continue to around 9 o'clock. We won't have a direct cutoff, but it'll be about a 2-hour program. So having said all that and having welcomed everyone here, I'd like to turn the floor over to my friend Diane DeRigo, who I've worked with for, 35 years or more. And Diane works with Nuclear Information Resource Service, and she's one of the world's foremost experts on nuclear waste. And she's going to introduce Mary. So, Diane.
Thank you, John. Welcome, everyone, to this solemn memory of a disaster that we all are hoping and praying and working like heck to prevent being repeated. And one of the people who's worked the hardest and the most effectively on this is Mary Olson. Mary came to NIRS to Nuclear Information and Resource Service in 1991. And prior to that, she was studying biology, working in biology labs. She also worked at a children's camp and picked up a lot of great skills managing a camp and managing dozens of kids and feeding them, so that it was the perfect training for the radioactive waste camping. And we had camps for radioactive waste, radioactive trainings. We've had summits around the country, mostly national, but international folks. And at NIRS, Mary spearheaded many gatherings of people and was totally natural at making sure everybody was facilitated, that we had a place to stay, we had food, we had lodging and all that. And the ability to interact with each other, spend time together. So what Mary has done is taken her skills and used it as the glue to help build what's really making the change, supporting the activists. And many of you here already know Mary. I'll give a quick summary of some of the major work and accomplishments that she did in her 28 years at Nuclear Information Resource Service as our staff biologist. And she spearheaded once again a petition to disqualify the Yucca Mountain proposed nuclear waste dump on Western Shoshone land in Nevada. She got together and gathered all of the technical reasons that this site violates the regulations for a permanent repository and presented them to then Secretary Richardson of the Department of Energy, and moved to have I think that's who the secretary was at that time. Anyway, she took the lead and took information that had been out there all over the place and compiled it together and synthesized it to make the technical case for the disqualification of the site. Of course, government just changed the requirements 4 times, so that every time it violated a rule, they changed the rule. In any case, to this day, that site is not going to proceed, has not proceeded. There's no nuclear waste there, and there will not be waste there. And she's very much amplified the Western Shoshone, the state of Nevada, the public opposition along the routes. When she came to NEARS, to our organization in the early 90s, one of our big fights was preventing that dump from being opened, and in order to enable people to understand that we are all at Yucca Mountain, she worked very hard on our campaign to prevent a mobile Chernobyl, to prevent tens of thousands of shipments of high-level nuclear waste, deadly waste, on the roads, rails, and waterways. And she did this with letters and petitions and campaigns that took advantage of all of the people that were involved. So very much in tune with the activists and the communities. I think what really drew Mary to NEARS was an ongoing campaign that had started, has been repeated over and over, is to prevent the deliberate release of radioactive waste, weapons waste, and nuclear power waste into everyday recycling, and to pretend that nuclear waste isn't radioactive. And Mary, because of her understanding of radiation, her experience with it, she knew that she didn't want to let the radioactive waste that was man-made waste be released into the environment. And she joined the organization, and together we successfully prevented the deliberate release of nuclear waste below regulatory concern. Mary took like a duck to water to working in Congress, a very, very tough battle. Congress, there's very few Congress members that aren't pro-nuclear if they have a position on nuclear at all. And yet Mary was able to, with her mind, she was able to weave and thread and create campaigns and use the kind of strategic knowledge that it takes. And because of that effort, we were able to prevent these nuclear waste shipments, this deregulation of nuclear waste, and to build momentum around the country. In the late 1990s, we were approaching the year 2000, Y2K. Mary initiated an international campaign. I want to say it was Mary who initiated, although people around the world worried about it. Once again, she was able to formalize a campaign against nuclear power and weapons, but mainly on nuclear power. What happens when all of these computers turn over to Y2K, to 2000, and was able to use that event to get all kinds of new people concerned about and learning about the nuclear issue. That campaign, preventing MOX, Nix MOX, was another one of Mary's campaigns. She was able to help fight the use of plutonium from nuclear weapons and nuclear power fuel. And then, speaking of irradiated fuel, she took on the dangers of nuclear fuel pools that could melt down and release enormous amounts of radioactivity. She was concerned about the integrity of the casks if you move it from the pools to the casks. And she worked on the issue at Prairie Island, an island Native American school was right next to the reactor, and worked with the nation there, worked with the Goshutes to prevent a supposedly interim site in Utah. It got licensed, but it never started. I could go on and on. The thing that Mary's going to talk about today is the thing that a lot of people kind of knew about. If you looked at the numbers, that radiation is more harmful for women and for kids, but Mary actually did the quantification, took the information, and it really has become her life work. And she's shared it at the United Nations, internationally throughout the country and the world. And it was actually probably part of what was mentioned in the treaty, the prohibition on nuclear weapons. There was a discussion at the beginning about the unequal impact of radiation on women. So I will move this over to Mary. She's the one we're here to hear. And I want to thank Mary for all of her hard effort. And so her new organization, which she has started, is Gender Radiation Impact Project GRIP. And so I turn the floor over to Mary Olson. And I think everybody here, no matter what you know about nuclear power, weapons, and radiation, is going to learn something new that knocks your socks off.
Diane, thank you. Thank you for your support always. I'm going to stick a bunch of stuff in the chat. And how do I do that? Where are you, chat? There we go. And then I'll get my slides up. But this will give you some links and some names. And yeah, so visit the chat, save it later. Thank you to the National Capital Area Hiroshima and Nagasaki Peace Committee for inviting me. Thank you, Diane, always for your support, and truly wonderful to hear your version of this time we've spent together, which is now a long time. I first met Diane in 1990. And thank you, everyone who's here, for listening. And I hope we'll have a chance for me to listen to you as well. So today is 77 years, and we are called by the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to remember and to vow never again. So in my memory, I have a very early image in my life. I am very short, maybe 2 or 3 years old, and I'm watching the candles as they float away on the surface of Stewart Lake at Circle Pine Center in Southwest Michigan. Candle lanterns to commemorate Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was likely 1961, not even 20 years after the atomic destruction. I was there with my parents who were on staff in the summer, and I'm second generation in activism, in science, and in evolutionary biology. Because hope is a necessary ingredient to that vow, if we have given up already, we cannot make that vow never again. I've been exploring hope, and I want to read just a short passage of a blog post I did in December 2021. I put in the chat the website, but it's genderendradiation.org. So just a passage. Be hope. Love, courage, wisdom, generosity. Hope is also one of these foundations. These do not depend on how recently we have uncovered them or thought about basing our life on a fundamental. They are part of us, woven in, or as used to be said, dyed in the wool, always there. Each, under the right circumstance, can become a verb: to love, to be courageous, to hope. If we go one step further, we can be love, and we can be hope. And I invite everyone here to let that percolate, because we're going to be bringing hope back into this discussion several times. But it's so lovely to be with people who are in DC tonight, and wherever you are. DC is one of my homes, although I left 2 decades ago. As you heard from Diane, I was on the staff of NIRS. We call it NIRS, that's the acronym NIRS, Nuclear Information and Resource Service. I joined in 1991, and symmetrically in 2019, I retired from that organization. I went there to support a campaign that had an enormous victory, although as Diane points out, we've had to do it over and over again. But the deregulation, the release of about 1/3 of the so-called low-level waste was part of the plan, and what took me to Washington to work together with people all over the whole country. And we won. We got Congress to repeal, well, to direct the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to repeal the Below Regulatory Concern Policy, or BRC. Now we're going to circle back to BRC in the course of this presentation, because we're going to find out that half of our global population, half of our national population, the female half, is also below regulatory concern. So you've heard from Diane about all the different things I was involved in. I know this is the profile of an activist, but honestly, I've always seen myself as an educator first. I didn't plan to work on nuclear energy and only stayed at Nuclear Information and Resource Service because I learned that more than 95% of the radioactivity in all regulated nuclear waste is in the irradiated fuel from commercial nuclear power reactors. A reactor is essentially a nuclear bomb with the clutch in, splitting atoms 24/7, releasing massive heat pollution and making new radioactivity that was not on this planet before in enormous amounts. And both heat and radioactivity is in direct ratio to the amount of energy produced, minus 2/3 because of thermodynamics. The steam cycle is what is in use at reactors, and 2/3 of the fuel goes to boiling water that has to be condensed back from steam, which is what you get when you boil it, back into water, and 2/3 of that energy does not actually result in electric power. So fission, making atoms split each other, massive new radioactivity. It is a decision, and we can change our mind. So I was mainly concerned about radiological hazards when I joined NIRS in 1991. I am a biologist, and because of that ratio of 95% coming from commercial nuclear power, I knew I was in the right place. And highly radioactive waste became my focus for the next 28 years. And we had win after win. But in truth, when it comes to radioactive waste or radioactive anything, there is nothing about it that can be described as a win. It truly defies anything approximating a solution. So when I say win, what I really mean is there were some really stupid ideas, and our team helped impacted communities, frontline communities, by mobilizing other people to see and understand that they too would be impacted. And together we stopped those bad plans. I'm just going to repeat a couple of them, and then I'm going to move fairly quickly to my current work because I think it's really where we need to focus tonight. But those bad plans included that deregulation of radioactive waste as BRC, or below regulatory concern, and we stopped it. It includes sticking the worst highly radioactive waste to storage on native lands, and we stood with tribes in saying no, and we stopped it. Like mobile Chernobyl, the cross-country shipment of the most hazardous waste to a temporary site. And if it's actually temporary, it would have to be moved again. And so far, there has been no humongous major shipping campaign. We stopped it. Like recycling plutonium with all kinds of never before used bomb additives into fuel for reactors that were made for uranium fuel. Took 20 years, but we stopped it. That one's really hard though, because it turned into a shapeshifter, and now the same plutonium is slated for new and improved nuclear weapons. And please note that there's nothing improved about a nuclear weapon. So that one hurts. But we also stood up to building new reactors. Most of them were slated for the region where I now live in the Southeast. 40 years after acknowledgement that fission is a really stupid way to boil water, and 3 Mile Island taught bankers that a nuclear asset would be an even bigger nuclear liability if there was an accident, that switch overnight, those bankers need to teach the new ones. In any case, I had the honor of being part of stopping many really bad ideas. And when you stop something, it's not the same as creating something new. That is rare. And I want to highlight one of the very first creative projects I worked on, a database called Deadly Radiation Hazards USA with Louise Franklin Ramirez and John Steinbach. They were Gray Panthers and now part of this committee. The database and map remain the only resource that includes radioactively contaminated sites, whether commercial, medical, academic, military, state, or federal. I'm very proud of that effort. It is still available online at prop1.org. So in 1999, in part because of Y2K, in part because of personal reasons, and in part because of the Nix-Mox plutonium campaign that was mostly centered here in the Southeast, I got NIR's board to agree to opening a Southeast office. And it was here that I helped this grassroots sustainability leaders of this region unite in dividing up the new reactor proposals that were breaking out like chickenpox in the early 2000s. Most of them were here in the South, not all. There's other places too. But here we had 12 sites, all but one were existing sites, and the proposal was to expand these. There was a total of 21 proposed new reactor units. And our community here in the region stopped or put on hold 19 of these. Only at the Vogel site in Georgia near Augusta did construction begin and is continuing. So it's a partial victory, but I feel really, really proud of the work that everybody did, because it was all pro se intervention by individuals on behalf of their organizations and local communities. We lost every single intervention, but within months or a couple of years, the utility corporations that had put forward those nuclear licenses agreed with us and canceled them. Unfortunately, there are still one site in Virginia, one site in South Carolina, and one site in Florida where a license has been granted. No construction has begun, but the license is still good for 20 years. So no new reactor unit, except for one in Tennessee that was started 40 years ago. It's one of the oldies, was completed. No other new unit has come online in the USA in this millennium. And for this, I am deeply thankful of the effort that we all put in. Fission is a decision, and we can change our mind. So after 28 years in 2019, I retired from NIRS so I could focus more narrowly on radiation. You can find my current work, it's in the chat, but www.genderandradiation.org, all spelled out. So John asked me to talk about the great pioneers who studied and worked on radiation in the early years of the radiological mess we call fission. I really can't do justice to their work tonight, so I'm going to say their names and invite you to remember them or get to know them. And again, their names are also in the chat. Alice Stewart, John Goffman, Carl Morgan, Rosalie Bertel, Alexei Yablokov, Jinzaburo Tagagi, Ernest Sternglass, Donnell Boardman, Judith Johnsrud, Steve Wing. All of those are gone. With us still are Helen Caldecott, Marvin Resnikoff, Arjun Makajani, Ed Lyman, Ian Fairley, Carmel Mothersill, David Richardson, Tim Musso. I've named those who are my personal friends. All of them were mentors, are mentors, and sources of inspiration. All warned of the harm of radiation. However, none of them taught me that biological sex is a systematic factor in radiation harm. This is the work I was called to do. And I've got to do a quick time check here. Yeah. Yep, I got to go to my slides. So instead of telling you how I got to this work, I'm going to dive right into it. So I need to share my screen. Is that going to work? Yeah. Okay. All right. So advertisement, quick quick PSA. Cindy Folkers and I are teaching classes on radiation. We're starting this fall. We're doing short courses online. We're going to be including various other presenters, but we're just sticking our toe in September, October, and December. Things like 3 sessions, 5 sessions, short courses. Check them out. They're at genderandradiation.org/classes, or just go to the front page and you'll see the link. So what I'm going to do here is reprise a talk that I gave in Vienna in June, 2 months ago, for the conference the day before the first meeting of the parties that have signed on to the new treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And we all hope the treaty is going to get better and stronger, but I am pleased and proud to say that I was invited to reprise a talk from 2014. Prior to the development of the treaty, my work was invoked as part of the evidence for using humanitarian law rather than military law for a nuclear weapons treaty. And we can get into a discussion of that, but I'm just going to go through these slides first. So I gave these in June in Vienna, and I'm giving them with you now. July 16th, 1945, the first nuclear detonation was conducted in south central New Mexico and was codenamed Trinity. There were roughly 15,000 children, women, and men living within a 50-mile radius of the test site. And so began the atomic age. The goal of fission, weaponized fission, making atoms split each other, is to release massive energy. My focus today is on the prompt gamma neutron pulse from fission. It is 5% of the total release, while persistent radioactivity fallout is 10%. This photo was taken from the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. It is a mistake to say that this photo is of the bomb. This cloud was, moments before, buildings, trees, homes, girls, boys, women, and men. And this was the city of Nagasaki. These are inherently indiscriminate weapons of mass destruction. More than 2,000 explosions have already occurred. Our planet is already deeply contaminated without waging a full-scale nuclear war. I need to acknowledge the personal side of this. My government chose to use the first nuclear weapons on cities full of people. More than 2,000 people perished in the blasts or soon after. 5 years later, the US initiated a long-term study of the atomic bomb survivors. Researchers assumed that humanitarian aid might skew the results of their study. They did not provide medical treatment to the victims they studied. Data resulting from the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is used widely, including by me here today. Speaking as only one woman, I need to say I am sorry. I deeply regret this history. I continue to use these numbers because what they say is vital to our survival. And the consequences of each and every one of those detonations is global. Radiation impacts our cells. When the reproductive cells are harmed, deformations are one outcome. This happens to all babies, plants, animals, humans. We also suffer loss of fertility, spontaneous abortion, miscarriage, possible heritable mutations, avoidance of reproduction due to uncertainty. Radiation is invisible, but we can see the damage it has done to these chromosomes. A clear spike in death of infants followed the 1945 Trinity nuclear detonation. This finding in New Mexico was only recently reported by Tucker and Alvarez in 2019. Consequences of nuclear tests are tragic and often irreparable. Nuclear colonialism is responsible for disproportionate harm to indigenous peoples from nuclear weapons testing. New digital simulation of the French nuclear tests at the island of Aurora by Sebastian Philippe and his team at Princeton reveals far greater impacts to a wider area than previously acknowledged. Cancer is the most studied long-term consequence of non-lethal radiation exposure. When genetic material inside a living cell is damaged, sometimes our bodies can repair that damage. Otherwise, the abnormal cell may sit quietly in the body for years or even decades before it makes us sick. There is no way to predict which exposure will result in cancer. In general, more radiation equals more cancer risk. However, even an exposure too small to measure could sometimes result in cancer death. This 2006 report, The Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation number 7, also called BEER 7, is the source of the data for the findings I'm about to present. In other words, I did not go and collect the data myself. It is all first-generation atomic bomb survivors. Children's bodies are small, so the same amount of radiation delivers a larger dose. Since children are growing, the cells in their bodies are dividing more rapidly. The DNA in cells is more likely to be damaged when in cell division. The A-bomb survivors were grouped by the age they were at the time of the bombing. These groups were tracked over their lifetimes. Cancer and cancer deaths were counted. The focus is on the outcome of the prompt radiation exposure from the bombs. It's an external exposure. There are problems with this data, but we can broadly say that those who were 5 years or younger when exposed had the most cancer at some point in their lives. And here is big news. Girls in this youngest group were twice as likely to get cancer at some point in the next 60 years than were boys. For every male in the birth to 5-year cohort that suffered cancer, 2 females got cancer. This is not all childhood cancer, it is total incidence. The BEER 7 report is where these numbers are found. The report itself does not discuss gender as a risk factor. I first published my findings in 2011. They are independent confirmation of work published by Dr. Arjun Makajani and his team in 2006. It's extremely important to understand that little girls are not a subpopulation. Biological sex was also a factor for those who were adults at the time of the bombings. Over their lifetime, women exposed as adults suffered 50% more cancer death than did men in the same age group. For every 2 men in these cohorts who died of cancer, 3 women died of cancer. This is the same information on a chart. It is a scenario based on the primary data. The bottom shows the ages the survivors were in August 1945. Those who were infants are grouped at the left, and on the right, the elders. Each age cohort was tracked across their lives for 60 years. Cancers were recorded for each group. Each bar shows the rate of cancer per 100,000 adjusted as if everyone got the same radiation exposure of 1 gray, to more clearly see age and biological sex as factors. Like I said, this is a scenario. It is easy to see that females suffered more cancer than males in every age group, and the difference is greatest when the exposure is in childhood. And I've put this life cycle picture in. Typically, you just see one loop, but with such big differences between males and females, I think we need to start talking about more of an infinity symbol. Why is biological sex a factor in harm from exposure to ionizing radiation? We don't know. One hypothesis from my mentor, the late Dr. Rosalie Bertel, is the greater amount of radiosensitive reproductive tissue in female bodies. This and other research questions need to be tested by qualified institutions of excellence. The answers will impact all of us. And in going to Vienna, they wanted me to give 3 takeaway points. And bear in mind, this is in a meeting about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So the first point was ionizing radiation is harmful to living cells. Harm is greater when children are exposed compared to adults. Number 2, at any age, radiation is more harmful to females than to males. Young girls are the most impacted by radiation measured as cancer across their lifetime. And radiation protection does not yet reflect this finding. Prior to the work reported here, it was presumed that radiation, like the weapons that make it, was indiscriminate. Not so. These points provide strong evidence for the jurisdiction of humanitarian law over fission, most especially nuclear weapons. I think I'm at time, probably over time, so I think I should stop. Thank you very much. I have a few more slides that can be shared if people ask questions that make them relevant.
Well, Mary, thank you. That was a truly wonderful presentation. You covered all the points that I wanted you to cover. So what we're going to do now is open the floor for questions, primarily for questions or pointed and brief comments about Mary's presentation. So I think maybe the best way to do it is, does everybody know how to raise their hand? If you go at the bottom, it says reactions. If you click on that, it will raise your hand, and then I'll call on you as I see your hand raised. So go to reactions and raise your hand if you have a question. And if you don't, then I have several questions that I would want to ask. So one of the questions, I think it was Arjun that raised this point in one of our programs, maybe several years ago, regarding women and girls and radiation. And the point that he was making is that when women are born, when girl babies are born, that they are born with their full complement of eggs. And that because those eggs are there, that they're targets for radiation, and he saw that as one of the factors. I don't know. Have you ever talked with him about that fact and how that might relate to what you've been talking about?
John, I wouldn't say this very often, but I used to take Arjun's classes and I taught Arjun that point, and I was so pleased when he picked it up and started making it one of the things that he brought forward, because the context in which I brought it forward to him the first time was the lag time between the arrival of atmospheric nuclear testing and when you start to see any health consequences. And so I was asking Arjun, what about the difference between an atomic egg, one that was born as a child, to a mother who was in utero in her mother post-atomic testing, compared to a non-atomic egg, which would be an egg that came from a pregnancy that predates the testing. So there's this line in 1945 when we started spewing radioactivity into the air from fission, and you have to go 2 generations to get to eggs that were formed after 1945. So it's an interesting question, and not one that I know how to quantify more than to point to it. Because while it's extremely important that sperm bring the half of the genome, and we now know they also bring some mitochondrial DNA, the machinery of the ova, the cell machinery, and that's not right to use that term. I don't like actually using that term, but the organelles and the cytoplasm and the mitochondria, DNA, and all the pieces of that original ova are from the maternal line. And so that was my question to Arjun, and we got into it and we both agreed it was important, and I'm glad he's still bringing it out. And I do believe that pregnancy and the presence of the primary germ cells, whether they be the ova or they be the spermatogonia in a male, are central to the whole question of intergenerational impacts. My work has not focused on intergenerational impacts, however. It has focused on somatic the difference between exposure to a male body versus a female body, and the role of age in that question. So reproductive, absolutely vital to our survival. Somatic has changed my behavior in field work when I discovered that I was 50% more likely to get cancer from an exposure compared to Arnie Gunderson and his team. And we were in Japan together and in Fukushima Prefecture. So I kept the women indoors, and Arnie and his bunch of folks who were willing to crawl around in cow fields and then clean up afterwards, of course, separate tracks, male and female.
Well, and thank you for that question. For the record, Kiyokanda and we were the first group of non-Japanese to actually enter the exclusion zone. We visited Namie a week after they opened it up, and we also were somewhat challenged by our loved ones here about the radiation exposure. We actually found a reading that was about 500 times higher than the baseline reading we took in Tokyo. So sometime we'll talk about that, but I see that there's a hand. Tomisa Starr has a question, and then Diane DeRigo. Tomisa.
Hi, and
Hi.
thank you for your talk. I just, I have a comment. I'm just curious. I don't want to, make presumptions or anything, but my father worked at the nuclear test site, and this was after I think they were only doing underground testing, and they were working with like hot material, but I spent the first 2 years of my life living with my parents in the Nevada desert. And interestingly, I have scleroderma, and it's an autoimmune disease. And there appears to be some association with it, in cancer. And also scleroderma affects women 4 times more than it does men. And so I just wanted to, make that comment. I don't know. There's probably a lot of things in the environment in the Nevada desert at that time, but not necessarily from the bombs. I don't know. The testing. But I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you, Tomisa. And I'm sorry to know that you've been having health challenges. And we can now, no one can say for fact certain today the exact cause of things, but certainly I understand. One of the pieces we didn't talk about my life is that I had a radiation accident as a young woman working in a laboratory as a paid research assistant, and the lab had much higher levels of radioactivity than most research labs. And living with that uncertainty is very challenging. And I commend you for keeping a positive forward sense of yourself and your life. And we all have good days and bad days, but certainly the Nevada desert did not stop being radioactive when they stopped doing atmospheric testing. There was 8 years, 51 to 58 above ground testing at Nevada test site. And there were about 100 detonations during that time. And the cumulative impact is not trivial. So yeah, you definitely had a radiation exposure, no matter what, whether you crawled around in the dirt or not. There's no way you didn't have one. I don't know how much exposure your father had, and I don't know what the situation was for him being able to clean up before he came home. But I do know that here in this region, people who were African-American workers at bomb factories were not given the same access to cleanup facilities and other things because of the Jim Crow laws. Now, I'm not knowledgeable enough to know if Nevada was the same, but I do know a number of families for whom we know the impacts were higher due to the color line and Jim Crow in the South, both at commercial sites and at nuclear weapons sites. So I hear you, and I encourage you to get whatever help and support you can get.
So Diane Dorigo has a question. Diane, or a comment?
Yes, I was going to ask Mary to elaborate on a short statement that she said about little girls are not a subpopulation.
Thank you. I have unfinished business with EPA because I understand characterizing the population as a population, and I understand using a population model for setting regulations. Unfortunately, it completely runs against anything biological to turn around and call little girls a subpopulation, which is what happened in a public comment session that EPA held, and I attended by phone, and it came up in the context of discussing centering regulations on the area most impacted, which on that chart I showed, it's very clear that you would, if you were going to be most protective of the life cycle, setting aside reproductive parts, because we're just talking about the survivors and that's lifespan. So in the lifespan from birth to death, little girls on that chart are clearly a much more impacted portion of that population than the rest of them. But they're not a subpopulation. If you call them a subpopulation, you can do what EPA has done, which is set them aside and say, we're going to deal with them later. Little girls in Moscow, little girls in Chicago, little girls in Buenos Aires, those are all subpopulations. But a little girl is an inextricable link in the life cycle of our species. And if you expose a little girl and then have women who are experiencing much higher rates of cancer because of their exposure in childhood, men experiencing much higher rates of cancer because of their exposure in childhood, it doesn't work out to just treat this as a population phenomenon. We have to treat it as a life cycle phenomenon. And we're not there yet. So I'm actually.
Right.
I just wanted to say, one of the
Go
things
ahead.
that Mary has said about this in the past that I thought was helpful to me is that little girls are the main link between this and future generations. Yes, sperm are also, but if you took away all that so-called subpopulation, there would be no future in the species. So we're talking about life cycle, like you said, but specifically that this is a link to all of our future generations.
So I'm going to take my discretion as a moderator here. Diane, I'm going to introduce you in just a second because I want you to talk about radioactive waste. But we're fortunate we have Dr. Dennis Nelson with us. Dennis is a downwinder from St. George, Utah. He's a retired research scientist in the Navy at the NIH. And Dennis, I just would like to ask you to reflect on Mary. I know that you and Mary are good friends and colleagues, but can you reflect a little bit on Mary's presentation before we turn it over to Diane?
Sure. Thank you, John. That was wonderful, Mary. I really enjoyed that. And I think it's imperative that we make these kinds of distinctions that you're making. We can't allow the polluters, the people who get paid to do this pollution, we can't allow them to make the definitions and decide who's impacted and who isn't. I grew up in southern Utah during the bomb testing era, the above ground testing era, and also the underground era. I lived in St. George, Utah from 1943 until 1959. And during that time, I was exposed to dozens, if not scores of atomic tests that were exploded in Nevada. And then the prevailing wind, the westerly wind, carried the fallout debris to St. George, my hometown, which is about 120 miles downwind. Now that's a considerable distance, but they measured very high levels of radioactive fallout in St. George during several of these tests. And these were not trivial amounts. These were in the Roentgen, 8 Roentgens per hour. That is a considerable radioactive load. And so it's very difficult to actually assign a risk from something like that. Plus the fact that it got into all of our life events. It got into our gardens. It got into our irrigation water. It got into our evaporative coolers. It got onto our clothing that was being dried on a line. And we were not told that any of these things could be dangerous. In fact, we were told that there's no danger. One case, they called it no immediate danger, but they said no danger. So we just believed them. We believed what they said. And later on, we found that they just lied. They out and out lied. They said that there was no danger, but they discussed the danger in their own private meetings behind closed doors. So how can we trust? How can we trust the government? How can we trust the government to protect us from pandemics when they lie? When they lie about radiation danger, they could be lying about pandemic danger. We don't know. As a biochemist and also an immunologist, I've done studies like this. I've done studies where I measured in a rabbit model, I measured the production of antibodies against vaccines in rabbits. We injected bovine serum into rabbits and then measured the antibody response. And we discovered, much to our surprise, that there was a huge change in maturation of affinity. That is, that in the beginning, the antibody that was produced was very low strength, low binding strength. And then later on, after time and boosters and so on, we've got a very high affinity, a very high binding strength. So that's very important in immunity. Anyway, I just wanted to point out that most of the cells that become cancerous are also what we call stem cells. And these stem cells are like eggs in a female body. A lot of them are with us when we're born. So if they get affected as a child, then you're carrying those affected cells for years. And until they start to divide, you don't recognize any symptoms. But once they're recruited into the dividing cell pool, then they start to express cancers because they don't have the proper mechanism for stopping division. And also, what you said about mitochondrial DNA is very interesting because we get all of our mitochondrial DNA from our mothers, and mitochondria have been shown to be important in cell division. Controlling cell division.
Yeah.
If we have messed up mitochondria, we're more likely to get cancer, or we're more likely to get a cell clone that doesn't stop when it's supposed to. So there's many, many things that have not been adequately researched. They have not looked at this. They don't care about it. They don't want to know. But I myself have had lymphoma. Lymphoma is a known cancer, radiation-caused cancer. And I was treated for it, and fortunately I'm in remission right now, but that was very scary. And I'm 78 years old, and it just seems to me that you can't talk about an exposure as being dangerous, not being dangerous, if you don't go over the entire life cycle. You've got to talk about the entire life cycle, because these stem cells can lay dormant for decades before
So
they're actually start to divide.
Thank you, Dennis. Those are really great observations. For the record, Rosalie Bertel's book was titled No Immediate Danger because of that reference you made. And she talked about, what were the total number of victims from all of the bomb testing and all of the nuclear plants and so on. And she came up with a number of tens of millions of potential victims, including anyone who grew up in the Midwest. Or the Northeast. Max talked about radiation exposure up in the Rochester, New York area. So it's not just the people of St. George, and it's not just the Hibakusha from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the Navajo uranium miners, or the uranium miners in the Congo. It's essentially what Rosalie Bertel was saying is it's all of us. And the Hibakusha actually have a saying, which is that we're all Hibakusha. We all have elements, molecules of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki explosions in our bodies. So I want to thank you and Mary.
Hey, John, I want to
Yes,
just
yes.
let people know that I failed to press send on that post in the chat. So all the links and all the radiation names that I wanted to share are now there.
Yes, they are. They are there right now. There's a
Yeah,
lot of
but I
other
failed to do it before. So I just want to say, check again. And I also, just for a moment, want to point out that we all have signs of hope around us. And this event is a sign of hope, and planting trees is a sign of hope. Every time we exercise, every time we use archival grade paper, all those things, babies, grandbabies, they're all signs of hope. So with that, I will be quiet, but I just wanted to stick that in.
So so I'm going to recognize Diane DeRigo now. I noticed you just got up, but you're back. So
I turned the light on so I could see my notes.
Okay. So Diane's going to talk with us briefly about her work with nuclear waste issues and where we are today, the concerns today. So Diane, if you can
Thanks.
illuminate us.
Thanks. I'm going to push the send on my note here with a link. Let me see. I guess I just push return or enter. There we go. So Nuclear Information Resource Service tracks. We don't have a full-time lobbyist, but we do track the bills in Congress. And one of the things that I'll go over that stuff in a minute, but one of the things that's we think about around Hiroshima Nagasaki days, when we're concerned about weapons and the history and the connection or the front for nuclear power. The other way around, nuclear power normalizes like what's acceptable for nuclear power, makes it okay to have a bigger danger from nuclear weapons, or maybe what's really going on now with pushing nuclear power when it really makes climate worse is the deep desire by the powers that be to continue with nuclear weapons and to continue desperately using nuclear power as a front for it. So the Fukushima disaster, there has been a lot of radioactive water collecting at the site, and the Japanese government and the TEPCO want to release that radioactive water into the ocean. One of the scientists at Woods Hole said at the early days of the disaster, the beginning of the Fukushima disasters, that all of the radioactivity at Fukushima is eventually going to go into the ocean, either on purpose or accidentally, but eventually, just because of entropy, it's all going to leak out. So that's really what's going to happen with the nuclear fuel chain, is we've really got to work to stop it so we can isolate to the best we can what's already been generated. And what's happening now, even though nuclear reactors routinely release radioactive water into the oceans or the lakes or the rivers on which they sit, there's been more awareness as reactors close. So at Pilgrim in Massachusetts, at Palisades in Michigan, all of a sudden, the people who have been living there with routine releases for decades are saying, wait a minute, you've closed the reactor and now you want to release all this radioactive water into the ocean or into the lakes and into the Cape Cod Bay. We won't have it. So there's fighting against it. And so the same kind of thing with Japan. We need to be pushing to prevent the deliberate release of all that radioactivity into the oceans. Once it's released, there's no recapturing it. So that was a connection that I wanted to draw, just to re-emphasize another way that nuclear power and weapons are similar and of the same ilk. But then to shift, perhaps not elegantly, but to save time, directly to legislation that we are fighting right now, that we need support from people who are so inclined. There are alerts on the Nuclear Information Resource Service website, which I put the link, NIRS.org. And then if you go to just NIRS.org, you can go to alerts. And we have an older alert on RECA, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. This would have expired in July of this year. It got extended for 2 more years, but we're pushing with frontline communities, perhaps many of the people on this call, to expand the compensation and the opportunity to apply for it to more locations, and from 2024 until the 2040s. And so expansion and extension of RECA. We need push on our senators and our reps for that. And so that is on our website, the alert for that. And we also have, I think people have heard, the IRA, the Inflation Recovery Act, which Manchin has agreed to. There's a reason he agreed to it. It has been touted as a very important legislation for many issues, including some of the renewable energies, and for pharmaceuticals, and for health, and for a few other areas. But what has not been mentioned, even in media from our own allies, is the fact that it includes massive subsidies to old nuclear reactors. So the whole bill is about $370 billion. About $50 billion would go to keep old reactors running and subsidize them with our tax money. So the push right now is, and this is pretty quick because it could get voted on in the next week or two, but it could take longer, is to ask that the nuclear provisions, the nuclear subsidies, the nuclear bailouts be removed from the IRA. And I won't go into a lot more on that. Also, Mary and I were talking about transporting nuclear waste across the country. Right now, the threats are to send it to mostly Hispanic land in Texas and New Mexico. Sites are getting licensed there by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they're not legal under the current laws of the land. So what we are calling for is to remove provisions in the Senate energy budget, and this we will probably have a few months to make these appeals to our Senate leaders. Well, actually, it's to Senate and House leaders because it's going to be negotiated in conference, but remove Section 310 from the Senate energy budget, the Senate energy budget for FY 2023. So those were a few of the bills that we are asking people to help fight in Congress. And thank you for letting me make my little pitch.
You're muted, John.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Jim. We'll have questions for Mary after Jim makes his presentation. Jim's gonna make a brief presentation as well, and then at that point we'll open it up for a more general conversation. So Jim Wagner is a member of the Friends meeting in Frederick, and he's also a member of the Hiroshima Nagasaki Peace Committee. So Jim, if you can talk briefly about the treaties and your vision of hope for the future.
Okay, let me see if I can share my screen here. Let's see. Yeah, I'm gonna give a real short version compared to what I intended. Since we seem to be short of time. Well, my name is Jim Wagner. I actually have training, PhD in molecular biology, so I'm very interested in what we've been talking about. But I'm also very interested in people power. So let's see if I can go through this fast. I was using here the June 12th March and Rally of 1982, which many are familiar with. If you're not, that was still I believe still the largest disarmament march and rally in history. 100 million, 1 million people were in attendance, it's estimated. And it was in 1982 at a time when the US and the Soviet Union had missiles in Europe. But that rally, which John and Hiroshima Nagasaki Peace Committee participated in, probably many other groups that are represented here, that rally is credited with, that and many others in Europe and across the US, is credited with helping to advance the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was a cornerstone, one of the cornerstone treaties of the nuclear age, which unfortunately now has been abandoned. But the just say this graphic up here, you can see what I'm pointing to, right? The yeah, okay. This was from 1982, and I like this. It shows people of all stripes, skin shades, rallying in New York. So actually a further connection on that was very interesting. I learned in webinars was that I believe the man's name was Bob Swan. He was in attendance that day, June 12th, 1982. I read maybe the accounts that I initially heard aren't completely accurate, but the upshot was that he was there and that he actually had a dream about a nuclear war between US and Russia, or Soviet Union. He mentioned it to his wife, and I guess his wife was instrumental in mentioning to a scriptwriter and a film producer. The upshot was that that thought, or that inspiration, combination of Mr. Swan being there, helped to create the television movie The Day After. So many of us are, maybe all of us are old enough to remember that in 1983. And the further connection is that Ronald Reagan saw that movie and was disturbed by it and started changing his tune about nuclear disarmament. So I'll cut to the chase here on my conclusions. I think I've covered some of the things. Let me mention maybe a few points about the INF treaty. So one important point was that these new weapons, what the issue was leading up to the treaty, were in the late 70s and early 80s. New weapons and systems, mobile launchers, were deployed by NATO and by the Soviet Union. And it was realized that these had first strike capability, and that issue of first strike is coming up today with these missile defense systems people have probably heard about. So if you have a system that's accurate enough, you, instead of the standard model for why we need nuclear weapons, you can launch your nukes, and if you have a capable defensive means, you can mop up or strike down any retaliatory weapons. So you have, hegemony over the situation. Anyway, that treaty, the demise, I guess I could cut to. The treaty was important. It eliminated a whole class of weapons and allowed for very rigorous inspections on both sides. So it's really a model for arms control. And unfortunately, the U.S. claimed that the Russians were not abiding by it, and there were counterclaims that the U.S. had anti-ballistic missile defense systems that were a violation of the treaty. So it fell in 2019. And this is kind of wordy here, but let me see if I can get to the important points. So what I wanted to be the take-home messages, the anti-ballistic missile treaty #2 there, that was also an important one. And that one was abandoned in 2002 by George W. Bush, unfortunately, so that the US could pursue these missile defense systems. So my theme here was people power. And I mentioned the connection with the television movie The Day After. There was also at least one song on the radio at the time. This was in my early adult years. I was clearly definitely affected by Sting's song Russians. What might save us, me and you, is if the Russians love their children too, if you remember that. So that was a top 40 hit across Europe and Australia, New Zealand, and the US. And there were other movies and songs about nuclear war in the 80s. So there's another example of people power. And then I guess my third example is that two men themselves, Reagan and Gorbachev, although Reagan especially had faults, his big one was his insistence on the so-called Star Wars missile defense system, which we're still dealing with. But he eventually saw the light, and the two really worked hard to advance the INF treaty. So there's personal interactions and individuals leading the way. As we all know, we're in dire straits now, and I guess my take-home message is I don't have to tell the choir here that the citizens need to become engaged like they were in 1982. And I have some preferences for how we might do that. And number 6 here, we need to become engaged. First of all, make our voices heard and to attract other people fast to this cause. I think our hope, Mary mentioned hope. The real hope to me is in the people, not in the leaders who are, not doing it. And in fact, all this business in Ukraine is, if anything, made the situation worse. The talk among the so-called leaders is that we need more defenses and we need to expand NATO, etc. So a couple points in 6 are that we can advance, or we can abide by our NPT obligations. As we all know, the U.S. is not working to disarm, according to Article 6 of the NPT. And there's a movement called Back from the Brink that everyone's probably familiar with. If you look online for preventnuclearwar.org, that's the website for the Back from the Brink campaign. It's 5 common sense policy goals, and municipalities across the US are getting resolutions passed in support of it. And then there's actually a resolution in Congress that covers the TPNW and also the Back from the Brink 5 points, and that's HRES 1185. So we can voice support for all these things, and it's a way we can use our current people power toward the cause. I've also recently become interested in what the Department of Energy is doing. They have a major role in the development of nuclear weapons, and there may be an opportunity there for us to attract younger people to the cause. In that, to me, we are in an energy crisis. We desperately need clean, renewable energy, and our tax dollars are going toward the development of destructive nuclear weapons. So our Department of Energy needs to hear some criticism and has some explaining to do to the people. So my bold bottom line was there's still hope, but the people need to make more of it, and in these and other actions. And I don't have to preach to anyone here, but I think mentioning, the children's future is a way, as Sting apparently did too in his song, to get to the hearts of people. So we need to get out there, and I look forward to interacting with others in that activity, all those activities, as we continue the struggle. Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you, Jim. You can stop sharing your screen now if you'd like to. That's good. So I just like to, that was a good presentation. Gives us a lot of food for thought and for the future. I'd like to point out that you're correct that it was Bush and Trump that abrogated the two cornerstone treaties, but I didn't notice that when Obama was elected and controlled both houses, and then Biden elected and controlling both houses, that either one of them made any kind of a move to rejoin either treaty. So I think that that needs to be a big part of our message, and a big part of our demand is to bring back the ABM treaty and the INF treaty, because those are such important treaties for actually raising the threshold to nuclear war. So thanks again for your excellent presentation. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to open up the floor for about a half an hour. It's 8:30 now. I'd like to try to end this by 9 o'clock. If possible. So I'd like to open the floor up for comments and discussion. And I see a lot of people here, a lot of old friends here. So anybody who'd like to comment, to say something?
I would like to say I'm sorry that I missed so much of it. I was having thunderstorm problems. But I put some links in the chat. I hope everybody will save your chat.
Yes. Everybody save your chat. And Mel has been working with our committee since I guess the mid 1990s or late 1990s, and his focus is on the issue of cultural work and the centrality of cultural work to the disarmament movement. Mel.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really, from the very beginning, John, your opening, Mary's discussion, Diane's discussion, Dennis, we're always interested in hearing your voice as a person affected more centrally. You did not talk about so much about your family who has been affected, the work that your wife does, and Jim, you crystallized so much. I'm here to lift what seems to have been a thread of all of the speakers tonight about this matter of hope. It really seems that we're in a desolate environment, but we have to be hopeful that our action, and Jim just spoke to this matter, of people power. It is really only about people power. So much of our discussion in the American political economy and our social polity is about voting. And voting by itself cannot actually be effective without the people power or the action of civil society. So the combination of those things is really vital to actually move any kind of needle. If we want to reverse the doomsday clock back some, it's really going to be about governance, more appropriate governance by people who concern themselves with more human and humane activity. We have to be in the street to do that. Most people know, and I'm really honored to see members of All Souls Church on the Zoom here tonight, because it was John Steinbach himself who actually moved me to this matter of nuclear weapons abolition as a kind of like the predicate for activism, when he introduced me to the children's drawings at All Souls Church. They were housed there. I was not aware of them in my staff role at the church. When he brought the Japanese survivors to the church for our joint discovery, and out of that came ministry at All Souls Church around the children's drawings. Many of you have seen the documentary film that was shown on Maryland Public Television. It will be shown again this Sunday night at 6 o'clock. It's called Pictures from Hiroshima Schoolyard, with these Hiroshima children's drawings as a central actor to the film. So we have an art form of film that centers artworks done by children survivors to talk about the essential matter of hope. Hope for our world never again to deploy these weapons of mass destruction against people again. So all of the language that we've heard today has centered on this matter of our own joint and several action. Sometimes that is true leather action and street action. Mary talks about, lobbying Congress for action. The Central Park action in 1982 was street action to actually move policymakers to actually think differently about the roles that we, all of us individually, can play in advancing the cause of nuclear weapons. So I would say that we have the benefit during this season for the Hiroshima Nagasaki Week. We're in it now. Also, we have the non-proliferation treaty talks at the UN to discuss the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And there was reference made to this entry into force. But an exhibition on Hiroshima will open on August 23rd at the Phillips Collection. For those of us in the greater DMV, this will be a very important event to actually center selections from the Hiroshima children's drawing to be married to Jacob Lawrence, his portfolio, which he called the Hiroshima series. It was done as a commission to respond to John Hershey's book called Hiroshima, which was done in 1954. He did this body of work in 1983. So those 8 panels will be married to the body of work for which our church is the custodian. Selections, also 8 panels selected by the chief curator at the Phillips Collection to be in conversation about Hiroshima as the point of departure of centering art as the discussion in the safe and warm confines of a museum, to invite policymakers and citizens to benefit from that conversation about nuclear weapons abolition. That is the theme of this exhibition, nuclear weapons abolition. And so please be invited. I will serve also as a docent. Also, church will have programming there. But again, this is a big shout out to the ministry at All Souls Church and John Steinbach for to kind of catalyze all of that from that very first summer in the year 2002, in which our congregation got involved in the Hiroshima Children's Drawings documentary film and our participation globally in this work of nuclear weapons abolition. So with that, I would say that the theme of these drawings is about hope, hope for this never again, hope for joining across geographic borders in friendship and discussion, deliberative dialogue, and action to encourage policymakers, encourage artists to take our rightful place in governance so that we do not have this thoughtlessness around this untold, probably misappropriated, misplaced spending on things that could be better spent on humanitarian needs. So with that, I want to thank you all for allowing me this couple of minutes.
So Mel, just take a very brief moment and let the group know a little bit more about Jacob Lawrence.
So Jacob Lawrence was he was a Harlem Renaissance painter, and had a very distinctive approach to his own artwork. Please forgive me for going this way, but whenever I talk about Jacob Lawrence, I also talk about his wife, Gwen Knight Lawrence. They were both in Harlem. They were both artists. He has most of the reputation, but Gwen was also, in many ways, a great influence on the life of Jacob Lawrence and his artwork. So we can't forget women. Mary talked about the gender disparities in art. We also have those gender disparities in lifting their aesthetic voices and vocabulary in the canon of art worldwide. Okay, so, but now Jacob Lawrence, 1941, he did this cycle called the Migration Series to talk about the migration of Black peoples in the South, migrating along that Route 1 corridor, the Underground Railroad, the Northern Corridor, up the Mississippi to the North Star State, to Minneapolis, out through West, following the Trail of Tears. We can make lots of historic references to that migration series. But in 1983, he got commissioned to do this work. Curiously, 1941 was the birth of the migration series. It was a series of 60 panels in which there was this Solomonic action to split the baby and have half of that exhibition of the migration series go to the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., and half of it go to the Museum of Modern Art. So the first Museum of Modern Art in the country is the Phillips Collection under Duncan Phillips, and then that next big major Museum of Modern Art before our own Smithsonian Hirshhorn was MoMA in New York. So with that, Jacob Lawrence was called America's painter. It's very unusual for an African-American painter to get such accolades, but he told an American story of great moment for the American history from its founding. So we give great honor to Jacob Lawrence as a major figure in American canonical art life.
Yeah, I wanted to get that on the record. So, Mel, what I want you to do now is to go to your keyboard and go to the chat and put in the information about the exhibit and the program in the chat so that people can get it. And then everybody else who's listening, if you go to your chat, you'll see 3 little dots on the right-hand side. If you click on them, you'll see at the top it says Save Chat. And if you click it, it will save the chat to your hard drive, to your desktop, usually. So please, before you leave, save the chat because there's a tremendous amount of information in the chat room today. So I'm not seeing hands up, so I'm going to take the liberty of calling on a few people. So I see that Leslie Suzanne is still there. So Leslie, if you can unmute yourself and maybe reflect a little bit and maybe talk briefly again, because we only have 15 minutes max, but maybe talk a little bit about your personal experience and your dad.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I think my main contribution is just the reminder of the fact that a bomb exploded in an instant over a city on the other side of the world, and the impact reverberates so many decades later in this country as well as elsewhere. My father took for those who haven't already heard the story, my father's crew took the only color film footage of the aftermath of the bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And his crew was there for several months. And true to what was said earlier about the danger being at least lifelong and potentially generational, my father died of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which he and his doctors believed was likely the late life effect of the time that he spent in those cities. And he therefore was viewed by other survivors as also hibakusha. He fought for decades to try to get the color film footage made available so Americans would understand what their tax dollars were funding. And he was not successful in that fight for most of his life. It was classified top secret and hidden. And eventually, his contact with a Japanese activist, Tsutomu Iwakura, led to a movement in Japan, a grassroots movement called the 10-Foot Campaign that pressed for the release of the films and raised money to buy the footage, tracked down survivors who appeared in the footage, which was an enormous project, and made several films themselves showing the survivors, reflecting on their experiences and on the impact of both being filmed and of having the films released, both of which were in many ways very traumatic for them, but which also they appreciated for having preserved the truth of their experiences. And so from my point of view, when my father died, his last wish was that his ashes be scattered at Ground Zero in Hiroshima. And so I went there after his death with my little girl then, she's now 39. And we lived in Hiroshima and we spoke to survivors, some of whom remembered my father. My father didn't tell me much of the story. I found out most of it and most of his point of view in it from oral history that a student from Columbia got out of him that I didn't know existed and only discovered 15 years after his death. But I tried to put all of this together to make a record for history in a book called Choosing Life, My Father's Journey in Film from Hollywood to Hiroshima. And I'll put that in the chat too. But I tried to bring the voices of all the impacted persons, the survivors, my father and my family together. And hopefully it's a testimony for both peace and hope. So thank you for letting me speak to that, John.
So thank you. And so I just want to recognize Max and Janice. They're having events in Baltimore. If you go to the Hiroshima Peace Committee website, we'll have the listing there. Lucy Duff is one of the founding members. If you go to the chat, they're going to have a program in about a week and a half. It's going to be featuring Arjun Makajani, who's one of the founding members of our committee. So there's a lot of things going on. But I'd like to ask Hideko Tamura to end our program. She's a hibakusha. And Hideko, if you can just say a few words and we'll end with that. Is Hideko still on the call?
She's on the call. There she is.
There she is. So you have to unmute. Let's see if ask to unmute.
Unmute.
Yeah, there you go. There you
Yeah,
go.
Fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, good.
Yes, thank you. I am Hiroshima survivor of 88 plus years old today. Have a number of radiation affected problems. Lifetime, I have nodules in my thyroid, tumors in my lung, and some problems with the liver. But in my youth, I had a great deal of endocrinological problems and very, very difficult menstruation period, apparently, which is generational and was passed down to my daughter. She had a similar problems. Anyway, in my mentioning this, I don't want you to feel any sort of a guilt or bad feelings because the civilians had nothing to do in dropping the bombs. I really do appreciate your concerns and having these commemorations. Survivors have, since we learned what it was that we were suffering from after the occupation, were determined to spread goodwill and peace. And my major concern is that whatever we do, and I do for the life that was allowed me, is to awaken the public awareness of the significance of the non-proliferation treaty. It rather than this, touting beautiful idealisms and experience and so forth. Right now, I'm very, very concerned that our planet is without public actually probably not being aware or actually realizing, and I understand why some folks were showing the day after movie today. But believe me, the real experience is so horrendous that if you think that the movie was scary, it was nothing like it. The people turned so horrific that most of us couldn't even discuss it. As if we turned into stone. We couldn't. So you listen to the Japanese hibakusha. Do they speak about their inward feelings and all these things? The Ukrainian people screaming and crying is a wonderful mark that they didn't lose their humanity. We did. Please, whatever you do, help public awaken to how important it is that it does not happen the third time. Thank you.
Thank you, Hideko. That we appreciate your words. So I am going to be driving up to New York on Sunday, and our committee is going to be hosting a supper for Nihon Hidankyo, four hibakusha and 2 interpreters, and we're going to have about 20 people there. So I will give them my regards, and also to your friend Setsuko Thurlow, who is in New York. So thank you for being with us. I want to thank everybody for being part of the program. And Ellen, I want to thank you particularly for setting this up and recording it. And as soon as Ellen has it prepared and up on the internet, I will make sure everyone has a link. So I'd like to say good night to everybody and thank you once again. And never forget, never again, and not the third bomb. Thank you.